Oh, it wants you to rotate.
Oh my god. I tried so hard. Okay.
What's she gonna do?
Can you hold my laptop?
Do you want to sit here?
Can you grab my laptop?
Can I?
We can slide down.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just so messy. It's a bit weird. Welcome to the judging panel.
I hate
Okay. Without further ado, we call this house to order and ask the Prime Minister to send the motion to the Wait, who's doing timing?
I can do it.
Okay, thank you, sir.
You good? Cool. In the history of political philosophy, the idea of a nation state and borders is actually an incredibly new concept, started in about the 1600s. We suggest that it has been an entirely failed project that has brought nothing but conflict and violence to all people. Therefore, we think that all states should seek to abolish it. Let's be clear about what we mean in this debate. First of all, this is a debate that is aspirational in its nature. This is not a debate about whether or not actual countries would do this, because they are self-interested and probably wouldn't, because it benefits them to keep those borders. This would be an absurd debate if we then had to prove why the United States of America would cede its territory. Instead, what we think is this is a debate about which world would be preferable to live in. One in which we've had the elimination and reduction of borders at their core, or whether or not the nation-state system, in whatever iteration of the opposition wants, but likely one that is much more grounded in the status quo, given that's how the course of history over the last 400 years has looked like, if that would be the preferable one to work with. Second, given this is about a reduction over time, we think that what this looks like is initially a start with the reduction of immigration policies and the abolition of enforcing them, and further on things like the abolition of the nation-state concept as a whole, and other things that affect. We are willing to be as extreme as possible within that realm. Thirdly, what we think we support on opening government is very simple. We support a cooperative style of living wherein all people work together in their communities, and we have regional forms of direct democracy as a basis of decision-making processes based on communal groups and where it is that people happen to live. We acknowledge that it is incredibly difficult to conceptualize in that world, but we think philosophically this is an easy stance to be able to understand. Yes?
Does this apply to trade, and how would local governments be structured and bordered?
So they wouldn't be bordered, right? Because we're eliminating borders. How would this affect trade? I mean, international trade as we know it would probably be instantly abolished because you couldn't have free trade agreements between nation states because there is no longer a nation state. We instead think that people are able to trade national resources from within one another, but also notice that a lot of countries and regions do have a lot of resources with one another. I think that there is still absolutely the capacity to do this because it's not like people prior to the existence of the nation states did not have access to resources, or at the very least resources that prevented them from living lives. So, first argument, why are borders an inherent form of violence? Notably, the importance of this argument is we think that violence is one of the most inhumane things that can possibly happen in the human condition, right? You only have one opportunity to stay alive, and I think that being subjugated to unjust instances of abuse and suffering as a consequence, I think fundamentally inhibits your ability to access happiness, which is at the core of human identity. So I think that the fact is that these are violent means that they should be opposed. 4 reasons as to why they're inherently violent. First of all, is that they are a specific tool of exclusion to ensure people do not get access to resources. The fact that something exists within my country means that I have every ability to violently act against other people who are trying to get to it, which brings us to our second premise, right? It is the fact that all instances of borders are always enforced with violence. This is either through economic degradation of others, so trying to ensure that they do not have access to resources, but it's also through things like immigration policies, which allows you to be deported or jailed for the ways in which you try to enter into states, but it also looks like things like military force when you feel that there have been unjust encroachments on your own state. But notice who this affects. It does not affect the decision makers who are responsible for enforcing this violence. This applies mostly to people on the ground who did not choose where they were going to be born, and in most circumstances have no capacity to choose where they would live in the future, something that we think we would be very happy to subsidize on opening government. We think that those people are much more likely to be attacked as a consequence, and therefore means that they're unjustly having had violence against them because they did not consent to the initial creation of the nation state. Not only because they didn't choose to be born there, they also didn't choose to be born, but more importantly, there's no alternative conception of the world in which they could live in right now, meaning they do not consent to this project in the whole. Thirdly, is that states are violent, borders are violent because they were necessarily drawn in a way that was very explicitly aimed to discredit and attack minority populations. What this looks like is the fact that borders were drawn in a way not only to ensure that indigenous populations and other forms of minority populations, such as Kurdish people, no longer had the ability to have access and land claims to where it is that they lived, but it also also serves as a way of trying to ensure that the interests of minority populations could immediately be dissuaded by creating a broader national concept outside of the conception of the South or of these regional populations, which I think in many circumstances acts as a means of opposing them when you are able to say, well, the majority doesn't agree, therefore what you want no longer is something that is achievable. Now, fourth point, it is that the nation state as a, actually no, I already said that. So, let's talk about how borders create the nation state system and why those are inherently violent and problematic. It is because borders, because borders at their core necessarily implant the idea of you having something that is yours due to the fact of where it is that you live. It is from there that you are able to have nation states as we have them exist, because people have the ability to defend those very things. But why I think these are bad are, first of all, it's because it allows political elites who live within those own countries to use their own wealth as a means of dissuading poor populations from understanding that they are themselves being exploited. Look at the fact that it is often people who are the most elite in any one country who claim the benefits of nationalism. They say, well, look at our GDP growth, or look at how wealthy our individual country is. It is a means of creating pride within populations for saying, look at how great we are as a state, noting, though, that they are themselves being repressed by the people who control those states. Secondly, it is that the benefit of the nation state that is most often claimed is that of the access to a collective identity. But we would note that the collective identity that states give often means that you have to create an other, which is often other nation states. You have to create a requisite which other states are worse than you, and therefore are inferior to your own state. The reason for this is as a means of control over people in your own state to try to be sure that you are able to maintain power over them. And it's also a means to try to garner support and justify your own self-interest, and often comes to the exclusion of others. This comes with its own set of impacts. First of all, it directly leads to xenophobia on the basis of you believing that other cultures are directly inferior to yours because they do not actually believe in the same superstructures that you do. But what that looks like more concretely in the modern day is modern imperialism, which claims to try to rectify the ill justices of these communities, which in many circumstances leads to the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. What our world provides is incredibly simple. It allows for the idea of fundamental human equality, where you no longer otherize other people to exist. What this looks like is more coalitions and sympathy for all people, and the ability to genuinely redistribute those kinds of resources when you are no longer clinging to the made-up concepts of Canada, which at best is neo-colonial, and at worst is something that actively harms all people who live within it at all circumstances. The nation state as a concept, though, also gets to dissuade all dissent to that concept by radicalizing you and calling you a threat to that very nation state. This minimizes the actual criticisms of those nation states brought by repressed populations. Finally, what we provide is a genuine conception of free mobility of people, which means that people have the agency to live wherever they please, in which way they think will maximize their own happiness. Secondly, it's that we have political structures which are directly in line with the interests of domestic populations without subservience to people abroad.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech and invite the Leader of the Opposition to open up their case for their side.
So I think on open opposition, we believe that borders have done a lot of bad things, right? And I believe that given that they are supporting taking all borders away, we can have some reasonable equal fiat power to say that we change immigration policy to a large extent, right? I don't think we need to defend, for example, turning down refugees and be killed unless we take them, right? Rather, I think we're to present a case that there are unique values that borders have that can provide to countries, and that they are necessary for preventing things like the economic destruction of a nation, they're necessary for preventing mass amounts of human capital flight and protecting you from external threats like colonialism, i.e. Palestine should probably be able to have a legal right to stop like Israelis from settling their land, right? I think that this is something that can only be accomplished with borders. I'm going to start with my constructive, and then I'm going to get into some refutation, but I want to start with their muddle, right? Because I think that they are a little bit too aspirational in what they're talking about, right? So they say we're going to get rid of all borders. Like, please, Ethan, are there school districts? Are there any municipalities whatsoever? Is someone in, like, China going to be voting on my fucking school taxes? That makes no sense, right? I think at their best, like, if we buy that this is the case, I think that in and of itself is a massive problem. I want someone that is completely unimpacted whatsoever from someone's well-being halfway across the world, and their particular municipal choices about, like, how they're going to design their cities, for example, get to decide those outcomes, and and literally everyone in those cities are completely outweighed by literally everyone else's votes, that's probably a horrible world to live in, where you have literally no say, no representation compared to like the rest of the world. That's bad, right? So I think reasonably, there are still like legal municipal borders. They're just not restricting people from like crossing them, for example. So you might have like residency. And also, I don't think that we get rid of divisions that exist, right? So there's still language barriers. There's still cultural barriers. There's still like people groups that still identify as having a unique ethnicity. And note, if you don't believe this is irregardless of borders, just recognize how many people groups exist and identify as a unique identity, even without borders, right? Like Kurdistan is a concept that people buy into and recognize as like a nationality, even if they don't have like a unique set of borders, right? So I don't think any of these sort of like reducing concept of the state goes on this side. On to our constructive very quickly. So firstly, we think that borders are a necessary step to like, prevent things like human capital flight, right? Like, so recognize that not everyone can move, right? This idea that state borders are violent ignores the fact that like someone that is like not everyone, what do I mean? Like, there's a reason why people in rural poverty in the US go up and leave to New York that by pretty much every metric has a higher quality of life expectancy for them. The reason is not everyone has the money, the funds, and the like affluence to be able to learn a new language, travel halfway around the world, get a job in a place that they're not familiar with, and like, you know, like live there, right? So I think what this means is that the people we're helping are not the most poor or the most needy, but rather the people that are the most affluent and able to move, right? And I think this leads to very tangible problems, especially in developing countries, right? What does this look like, right? There are studies that show that many developing nations, when they increase their investment in universities, actually see a decrease in the average educational outcomes of their people. Why is this, right? When you give someone an access to an education, you take people that are elite and smart enough within that country to and give those people access to college. They're then qualified enough to get a job at Google or a job in the UK working in a hospital and immediately leave, right? So the result is that because we now enable people the smartest and most qualified people within regions, even if they're not within, even if there are no borders whatsoever, right? The fact that they're leaving poorer areas where they come from to go to richer areas that have better opportunities for them, which is something that uniquely wealthy and affluent and educated people do, leads to massive lack of human capital, especially in developing parts of the world. This means that people lack doctors, they lack teachers, they lack engineers to build basic infrastructure and gain any degree of economic independence, which leads to massive cyclic poverty in a lot of developing areas. But moreover, it decreases any incentive whatsoever to invest in your own people, when in a developing area, any investment in human capital leads to no returns whatsoever when that person literally leaves and you get no return, right? We see that this leads to cyclic lack of development. For that reason, we think borders are a necessary step in order to get any degree of development, right? There's a principle here though, right? Which is that you leaving does not just affect you as an individual, but rather we seek a more collectivist view of what an individual's moral worth is, which is that it's not just about you moving, it's about how you moving affects the other people. If you're a doctor that leaves your country, it's not just that you get benefit from that, but tons of people within your nation are hurt, right? And so we think that therefore there is a legitimate reason for the use of violence, right? Note that the use of violence is not always bad, right? We support things like, for example, laws that prevent people from murdering each other, and the state can use violence to enforce those laws. I think insofar as we prevent massive amounts of harm through human capital flight, I think that type of violence is justified in these cases. Moreover, we think that you get a concrete protection from external threats, right? So recognize that tons of countries exist to prevent their citizens from unique cultural threats that exist, right? So for example, we'll get into some clear cases here, right? So I think that what would happen is that countries for example, Palestine have no legitimate claim to stop Israeli settlement, right? But likewise, just look at the way that settlement is used to take over areas of land, right? For example, China actively sending Han Chinese people to displace Tibetans so that they would have a majority control in that region, right? Or Russians using Russian majorities in Ukraine to gain control. I think it is highly likely that powerful countries like Russia and China would use the fact that there are no restrictions on immigration to send people with their ethnic backgrounds to gain control over border regions. I think that even if it still happens in the status quo, it is substantially more likely to happen on their side of the house when there is no legal or moral argument against it, and they can't use the power of their border to prevent literal takeover of their country, right? Notice that when this happens, they often it's very easy for these people to get oppressed, right? Because China does not give a shit about the people that they're taking over, which means they are often denied rights and no longer have an ability the state gives them to stand up for themselves. We think that nation state might be morally arbitrary, but it is necessary to fight out for your people group. I think that a group of people that do have a state have more power to prevent oppression than one without it. I think it is incredibly important, and that's why I'm incredibly happy to propose. Sure.
Why wouldn't developed countries accept doctors as they do in the status quo in your example of the NHS within your doctor?
So it's comparative, right? Obviously, to some extent, they would still accept some number, but comparatively, one, we would support maybe a change of borders where we just don't let people leave. We're fine with that too. But also just the number range changes. So I think statistically, the people that are going to be able to move, if you accept anyone who's going to move, tend to be richer, tend to be more educated, and so on net you lose human capital either way. I just don't think that's a good enough response. Also notice that this is also about economic policy, which we think can be crippling, right? The fact that richer areas are able to produce goods substantially cheaper can destroy the economy of poorer regions, right? This looks like, for the example, the United States being able to subsidize rice and moreover produce it using more automation because they have the capital to do that, and then crippling the economy of Haiti when they can sell it at less price than the rice farmers that live there, right? That means that people that rely on those industries in order to make their basic needs met lack any power to compete against countries that have comparatively low wealth and that are able to drown it out and take over their ability to feed themselves. I think that at minimum, countries deserve the right to protect themselves from economic takeover that is destructive. Even if there are some cases where free trade is good, the fact that there are moral and legitimate claims to defend people's economic and political rights is a reason why you should defend borders, at least to some extent. Refutation. I think that Ethan gives a lot of talk about like, aspirations and morals without any actual impacts, right? I think that the idea is we are accepting violence, we are accepting nation state which may be bad, and it means that people that literally starve to death from being taken over by like other economies that are able to put all of their workers out of business, and they aren't overtaken by oppressive countries that will seek to deny them any degree of autonomy and self-governing. I am extremely proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for their speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister for an address that does not exceed 7 minutes. Speaker.
Can you put your glasses in?
For some reason, we drew arbitrary lines in the ground separating people from the land and giving power to states that never have to acknowledge them and never want to acknowledge them because now they have an arbitrary power over the people in dictating what land they deserve, what land they can access. We have decided that these lines are an absolute truth, and this rhetoric of this land factually belongs to me, look at the lines, is the way in which nation states are able to be oppressive, is the way in which nationalist agendas are propagating oppression against ethnic enclaves. Two things in the speech, dealing with the entire mechanism of opening opposition on movement, and then rebuilding everything Ethan said, because it wasn't actually correctly dealt with. So, on opening opposition, they say that only the rich can move, and this is a problem. So, the responses are many-fold. The first one is that in status quo already, note that the nation states are already horrible for these people, and all people cannot move, because trying to do so would break international law. So the movement idea doesn't work in that level, but also those places that lack doctors or other professions will still lack doctors in status quo where nation states exist, because you cannot get people to fill in those holes. Finally, this debate isn't just about the movement of individuals, right? It is not just about all people in Eurasia, or like trying to go to North America for better opportunity, or vice versa. It's not that all people in worse communities will try to immediately leave. This debate is also about things like indigenous populations being able to have moral claim to their land, right? Because some indigenous groups have correlation to land in the US and Canada, but an arbitrary line has been drawn dividing that connection to their land and driving them out of their connection and ability to access those particular areas that are important to them. It is also about reclamation of land that your ethnic group or religious group or whatever group have you considers valuable and considers a part of your identity, and why those borders are necessarily the barrier to your ability to access that at all. So, then, if everything on moving falls, because again, this debate isn't just about people wanting to move, then insofar as their scope as what this does on regional populations has fallen, opening opposition mechanisms have not really been, have already fallen. There's also three other things I'd like to clarify about why opening opposition case falls fundamentally, is that Ethan wasn't too aspirational, right? Like he already said like direct democracy in regional communities is probably the way this will work. He also said maybe we'll support subsidizing the move, but also barriers exist insofar as you provide them agency. It's not like we're funneling them from place to place. The main impact that we're trying to get to is this access to agency at all, and your ability to have that choice in moving, if that is something you choose, or reclaim the land that you particularly think is valuable, that has been excluded for you by nature of state borders. Sure.
Okay, so if you can aspirationally remove all borders, we'd be in favor of like adding and redrawing borders to give indigenous people a state that they can actively protect, as opposed to on your side where they have no form of protection.
Great. This still doesn't work because because the existence of borders at all, your ability to have exclusionary zoning policy at all, means that the ethnic minorities who have connection to land but have zero power against the nation states are still going to get fucked over 10 times out of 10, because it is the people who get to draw the lines, who hold the power and hold the rhetoric in which they are able to control which states get which. So even if they get to perfectly redraw the lines, this still is the case that they're unable to access particular minority groups who have already been oppressed by those border lines, and they still will be. So, why broadly on the comparative is borders at the highest truth something that is incredibly harmful, something Ethan brought to you, but I just want to clarify even more because I feel like opening opposition hasn't understood it. Colonialist states, like Canada against indigenous populations or the US against Hispanic populations, these are mechanisms by which those colonial states were able to impose particular restrictions on their ability to operate within that own land. It is the way in which they're able to control the rhetoric for those individuals and their claim to that land in the first place. The very existence of borders, whether we perfectly redraw them or not, is the political tool that is used to deny all those land claims made by those groups of people. It is a neo-colonial structure that is being imposed on them because they just simply say, oh, you think this land belongs to you? Well, look at the map, look at the borders. Facts say that you don't actually have a claim to this land because of the arbitrary borders that were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right? This prevalence caused borders to arbitrarily act as a trump card, as rallying rhetoric towards fueling exclusionary nationalistic agendas like the BJP in Kashmir or Erdogan against the Kurdish state. Those are the same nationalistic agendas that use the rhetoric of look at the borderlines because international law says borderlines are the truth, but which is the mechanism by which those nationalist governments are able to say you don't have any claim to this land whatsoever as a minority group just because the whole world had decided on it using borders. That is why borders existing at all is a harmful mechanism that these nation states are able to use. But also, nation states, as Ethan provided, claim to get collective identity, but it also exists in the world of otherization. That is the way in which you get support, and excluding other individuals is the way you're able to build that rhetoric further. Even if they're within your borders and those oppressive nationalist agendas are harming people within the borders, that means they get zero recourse because the nation state holds power over you entirely, and you have no say of your actual claim of what you deserve or how you should be treated within those regions. This means borders don't preserve anything but refueling exclusionary politics because for some reason we decided that borders are the highest moral truth that nobody in the world can violate. So, in a world where borders are eliminated, what does that world look like and why is it so much more preferable? It is one where states lose a major tool of zoning ethnic enclaves and denying them autonomy. It is one in which land claims actually have to be considered at a reasonable level, not one in which they just say, oh, but we have a border. It is one in which nationalist rhetoric that opposes entire peoples means they have less momentum in their ideological beliefs because they are no longer able to default to look at the globe, look at the lines in the ways in which they control rhetoric, in the ways they control those ethnic minorities. And finally, in defending borders, recognize that countries often use this for violence. In fact, many nations use violence first, then justify those same actions by saying, oh, but they were close to our borders. Your ability to justify so many immoral actions just on the premise of having a border is the thing that fuels nationalistic agendas that are being so pernicious on ethnic enclaves, on individuals who have a claim to the land but are never considered by the very virtue of the arbitrary lines that we decided to draw hundreds of years ago. So proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close up the front half of this debate.
like all the practical implications. Okay, so first, on the principle. We really just get this broad idea coming out of opening government that like, it's arbitrary where you're born, therefore you should have the right to leave. Okay, we tell you that like the principle in this round, so like even if you are arbitrarily born somewhere, should be about the societal benefit that your movement has, right? So it's arbitrary where you were born, it's arbitrary where everyone is born, but it's not arbitrary as to whether or not like you're going to allow for more or less investment into a country. So we say that given that it's arbitrary, whether like if it's arbitrary where you're born, it's also arbitrary as to the amount of money you have once you're born and if you're able to leave. And on the basis that most people probably won't be able to leave once they're arbitrarily born somewhere, it's probably better then that they have more access to wealth and we don't have like capital flight and we don't have human flight when like in the new policy, right? So like on the comparative, even if your place of birth is arbitrary, the resources that you have access to get far worse in a world where you don't have borders. We'll get more into that when I talk about the practical implications. But I think that's enough on the principal class to prove that why it's the case that given the nature of where you're born is arbitrary, it's probably good that we have more social benefits to people. Okay. So then on like all of the practical implications of this round because they probably matter more. Okay, so first I want to talk about like I guess I'm gonna talk first about our case. Okay, so a few things. First, we talked to you about like human flight and capital flight. We got the two main responses coming out of opening government. So first, they tell us that like under the status quo, either like they say that like people can like still move or like people and stuff like that. So a few things on this. First of all, I tell you that that's still uncomparative, right? Because even if people can move today, it's really hard to move because as they point out when they're constructive, it's hard to move for reasons such as like laws on like mass movement, right? But our claim is not like on like whether or not you can move today. It's about the fact that the quantity of migration becomes disproportionately more and also disproportionately in the hands of like the smartest individuals to move out in a world with open borders. So we tell you that that's like far worse that they want to talk about mass movement, right? They can't like on one hand stand for saying people already move and on the other hand say that it's really hard to move. We tell you we probably want that. But secondarily, they say that like those places still lack doctors today. Okay, so on this, I tell you that we have more of an incentive to like first like there are like doctors in these places, but their motivation to leave becomes worse at the point at which they can leave, and so it's really easy for them to leave. But secondarily, we say we have more of an incentive to invest into these countries to produce more doctors and have them staying there in a world where you got things like labor markets not having high risk of people just leaving, right? So in a world where like the case that Jacob gives you is true, and there are high rates of capital flight because the smartest and most affluent and most elitist people and maybe people with like high intelligence are choosing to leave in a world with open borders, you also decrease your incentive structure to invest into those countries because it's more likely that the people living there are going to move out of it, and so your investment is more risky into the developing world. So we tell you that we reduce that risk by having a border around that area so that people can't necessarily leave, making it harder for them to leave and therefore having more payoff on that investment. I tell you in a world with open borders, you're more likely to now invest into already developed areas because you have more of a return on investment. That's like the rationale that investors would make on doing so. But we also tell you that this like, yeah, I think that covered most of the investment stuff. Alright, okay. Second of all, okay. Second of all, I'm going to talk about identity. Okay, so they give you like a few points on this. They tell you that like things like land claims are denied because of borders, and they also say that like you have like a power imbalance where you want to maintain power over people in a world with borders. I'm going to deal with both of these points. So first of all, I think I already gave this in a POI about how we can probably draw back borders. But second of all, I tell you that in a world with borders, at least you have more ability to protect yourself. So this looks like, and this was the uncomparative analysis that we got coming out of opening government, and I don't think closing will probably be able to respond to it because it's like simply true that if you're able to have power and over your like a political power within your country, you're more able to protect people living there, and you're more able to protect your identity there, right? So I tell you that in the case of like Kashmir, for example,
impact of the legal and moral argument of borders stop Russia and China, your two examples in the past?
Okay, so I tell you that, first of all, it becomes a lot easier for China to, take over the world, in a world where they can literally send people from their industries around the world and, start up factories in every single country around the world. So if you wanted, maybe it hasn't completely stopped them, but it becomes far easier for them to spread around the world and have massive political and economic control in a world where it becomes really easy for them to open up markets everywhere. But second of all, I tell you that in terms of exploitation, it just becomes a lot easier to stop it, where you can advocate for yourself because you can say that you have a right to the area that you're in because of the border, and you can say that you have a right to land claims. This is what a lot of people do when they talk about land claims today. They talk about the fact that it was land, indigenous communities' land to begin with, and that's what they ought to have the ability to stay on it. That is the very justification that they try to use to prevent exploitation. Maybe it's not perfect today, but it's a lot better and it's a lot easier to use that type of explanation, that type of rhetoric that we're trying to use today, into the future. Okay. Yeah, I really don't think I've done anything. Okay, so yeah, at the end of the day, what do we prove on opening opposition? We tell you that in terms of a comparative, we give people the ability to protect themselves. We stop having massive amounts of capital flight and human flight. We say that people who are arbitrarily born in places will be way better off in a world where there's more social gains to them. Very proud of Stanford.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and call upon the Government Extension Speaker to open up the back half of the debate. Hear, hear.
We're going to uniquely contextualize this debate in countries where borders are the most arbitrary and the harms of continued border enforcement are the most severe. We're talking specifically about post-colonial states which are economically locked out of the system of global capital and often with borders drawn up by colonists who pitted them against one another in a battle for proxies. We're going to afford 2 points of extension. Firstly, on the benefits of political and economic integration, where we'll extend on the mechanisms provided by opening government. Secondly, about solidarity for post-colonial states. But before that, some refutation. We hear from opening opposition that ethnic minorities will be forcibly mistreated by settlement, and they brought up things like predatory actions, like China using human wave tactics to take over the world, for example. We put to you that things like the US, for example, strong-arming Nigeria into unequal trade, will still happen on both sides. It is not, in fact, this is precisely what China is doing right now by trying to settle individuals using unfair economic and immigration agreements with various countries across the developing world in order to gain economic control and economic success. We don't think that, however, the converse is true. Let us say that, for example, if the US strong-arms Nigeria into unequal trade, people from Nigeria can't reap the benefits of US gains from this trade. This is something that on the comparative is allowed when we allow some degree of free immigration between these countries. Moreover, we put to you that in an unequal world, allowing some people to escape at least allows some of the exploited to reap these benefits. We might hear the argument for closing opposition that the US owes a unique obligation to its own people because they pay taxes or something like that. But we're going to put to you preemptively the unique claim that essentially the US actually extracts more from the people in developing countries right now today than it does from its own citizens. So we owe a unique restitutive obligation to protect them. Then they say people will lose their identity and marginalized groups will lose out. First of all, we point out that we still have local governments that pass local regulations. We imagine that what this looks like is a highly integrated version of the European Union, for example, where separate states can still exist with their own identity, but nevertheless, the fact is people can move freely between states. Similarly, people moving between states will look like people moving between cities in the US. Cities can identify with, for example, particular ethnic groups or protecting particular ethnic groups, but the large point is that people can freely move between these cities, or like between states in the Schengen area. So we think this is a unique vision of what this looks like. It doesn't erase local identity to a large, to a total extent. First point of extension about political integration. I think that OG did a good job in explaining the benefits of political assimilation, but I don't think they really explain how this happens in a concrete, mechanistic way. We think that this creates a more egalitarian society for a number of reasons, particularly in first world countries. Firstly, to the mechanism of direct interaction. That is to say, you're likely to meet more economic migrants in your line of work and grow up with the idea that these people matter and are a permanent presence in our society. Secondly, they can influence the political zeitgeist. That means that ethnic minorities can emigrate and influence local governments because they have larger populations in local elections, or at least the cities where most of them choose to go to. That is to say that even if racist people exist, and we think that we'll agree that there will be backlash on both sides against increased immigration, at least they have a power to influence the norms that are created by political regulations and by the laws that are passed. So we think that in the long term, this solves the problem of a lack of political assimilation. We think that economic integration therefore happens and emigration becomes attractive for many of these people. OO's response to this is kind of the idea that only the richest people will be able to migrate. That is to say that only the very wealthy individuals will be able to move to the first world. A number of responses. First of all, this is an argument accepting refugees. Against accepting refugees, for example, given that most refugees are often the most economically advantaged within the countries that they're fleeing from. If we can benefit a small subset of people, we should benefit that subset of people instead of denying everyone the benefits of integration. Secondly, we think that this washes out in the long run, because if more people emigrate to the first world, it becomes cheaper to do so due to economies of scale. So we think that on the long run, the cost of immigration drastically decrease. Thirdly, we think that even if all this isn't true, and even if some people are left behind, we give the first world a reason to care about the people who are left behind, and give them a reason to care about the economic development of disadvantaged states. The reason for this is that they will be more directly affected by turmoil or conflict in other countries, because it will lead to an inflow of economic migrants from these countries. To avoid this spillover, given that countries, for example, still care about scarcity and economic resources, we think that they have a greater incentive to invest in aid to stop conflicts happening elsewhere in the world, because they know that they will be more directly affected by the impact of the conflict that is happening elsewhere. So we think that even if some people are left behind, and even if only the richest emigrate, we think there's net positive incentives for first world countries to solve this emigration and to solve the root problems that led to this economic immiseration and disenfranchisement. What are the benefits, therefore, positively that we can claim, given that we create all this economic integration? Firstly, labor can go to where it is valued the most highly. This is a pure economic benefit that OG alluded to, but was nevertheless not sufficiently explained. This means that people with specific skills, for example, in industries that are not doing well in their home country, can make a better living for themselves by going to a place where they will actually be paid and they will be actually valued for their work. This solves large problems that plague developing countries, threats of development, like seasonal unemployment, for example, as a country moves from one industry to another or tries to transition to a higher tier. We think that this allows people to repatriate their profits back towards their families back home, and we think this is incredibly important. Second benefit, we think that economic interdependence and the fact that neighboring states are more likely to exchange large numbers of migrants means that they are less likely to go to war with each other, because then they more likely feel the direct economic impacts, and moreover it's harder to justify a war to your countrymen when you're going to war with a country that contains a large number of people whom they might be directly related to or whom they might have constitutive attachment to. Therefore, economic interdependence and greater immigration actually means that we drastically reduce the scope for international conflict, especially given the fact that conflict, just due to purely logistical and historical reasons, tends to happen in nations that are neighbors to each other. This takes me very nicely to my last point of extension about solidarity for post-colonial countries. Yes.
Okay, so the fact that you're independent doesn't mean you value them, it just means that you rely on their stability, right? So you're more likely to intervene to institute a regime that will have policies that are in your favor because you rely on that state. Economic interdependence is what led to neocolonialism to control more.
I don't think so. It means that you'll necessarily care more about, like, for example, the economic upliftment and the development of individuals within the country. Because, for example, oppressive and brutal regimes are less sustainable in the long term. And moreover, we don't think that many of your countrymen who then come from that country will be okay with instituting a repressive regime in the country that they came from. So we think that in terms of the political cost, they become far higher. So we think the history of colonialism is the arbitrary division of borders by colonists fighting proxy wars with other European powers. And what they often did is to play up nationalism in this newly created state, to divide them against their neighbors, even though both states often share a long history of cultural connection. This divide and conquer strategy has often divided up the entire developing world into discrete states that share actually quite a large historical connection. What happens on our side is that the nations most likely to open up their borders and benefit from free immigration are most likely to be post-colonial states because they have many cultural similarities and at a similar stage of economic development. So, for example, organizations like ASEAN or ECOWAS will become empowered. We accelerate the integration of these states. Why is this beneficial? Because we create larger mega-states with more bargaining power in international organizations and the ability to stand up to colonialism. Moreover, we link up nations that were historically split up despite the cultural attachments that they have and forced to antagonize each other on the grounds of arbitrary bases. This is a critical point because it is an intermediate step between the utopian, borderless world of OG and the world we live in today. The first states that are likely to use this and are likely to benefit from this are states in post-colonial societies which will efficiently benefit from the fact that they're historically connected but arbitrarily cut away. So because we do what's best for these countries as well as their economic upliftment, we're proud countries.
I thank the government extension speaker and call upon the opposition extension speaker for an address that does not exceed 7 minutes. Here.
Double checking.
I should get my screen. I'll get it.
first thing you're going to learn in any intro political science class is a state is defined by its monopoly over the use of force. The important thing to understand is as you decrease the power of the state, i.e. its borders, its ability to regulate things, someone has to come in and fill that void to provide those rights and to be the mechanism for enforcing force. I'm going to explain why that's privatization and why that gets way worse in both worlds, an extreme world and just, I guess, a more practical world, since I have the unenviable position of having to go up against both the teams. First thing I just want to point out, I've been trying to flag this forever, so if either team ever says that they didn't have a chance, that's on them. I've been standing by your eyes the whole time, so let's get that out of the way. Alright, so with that being said, let's just get quickly into a little address of the supplementary and expenditure while coming out of our CG. So first thing, we have this idea that you get less wars because people are more directly affected by wars, particularly presumably developed countries, as people flee there after the results of wars, right? I'm going to explain that this is uniquely predicated on the continued existence of a welfare state. I'm going to explain why that is very unlikely to continue when you have the ability for people to freely move to those countries, why there's massive incentive to the country to basically cut any programs for refugees or any other type of people coming to their states, why that gets far worse when that's out of the house. The other things I want to mention, this idea of, I guess, post-colonial unionship and trading coming between towns. The only issue with that is the main problem they face is not labor, it is capital, right? So the ability to just move to another country that suffers massively from massive unemployment and no access to capital doesn't mean you're suddenly going to get them richer, right? The issue is that you don't exist in one ASAN nation and not the other. It's the fact that you don't have access to capital in either of them. Moving a bunch of unemployed people between countries isn't going to save anyone's life. Realistically, and I think like this, most people just move to developed countries when they have the ability to move out. Those, again, with the access and resources to buy plane tickets, boat tickets, whatever, that type of stuff. Okay, with that being said, let's get into my extension. The rest will be integrated with both teams. All right, so the predication for borders, the rights and obligations of the state is predicated upon borders because that's what they are defined as their jurisdiction for power, right? The idea is basically there is a monopoly on the use of force, which means within that region the state can enforce, is the only legitimate actor of force. They can put you in prison and things like that, but they're also supposed to uphold your basic rights. They're supposed to give you those basic logistical things. The issue with this, and again, I would love to hear what's going to happen to citizenship under this model, particularly coming out of OG, is when you then move into these countries as basically immigrants or some other form of, expat, you're not going to be necessarily owed those same amount of rights, and this is critical, because there's no now incentive, and actually there's the only incentive, to reduce the amount of welfare or amount of access to general resources for most people. No country is going to allow basically an infinite government spending on an impossible amount of people who can come into their country at any time and claim access to basic services basic rights and services that will then basically bankrupt that country. This means that you then have massive movements to privatization to make sure that all those things are only provided by private corporations that you have to then pay for, right? This is uniquely pernicious for things like healthcare. You understand that if you're a refugee fleeing a war, if you're still going to die in that country, even after escaping the one you just fled because you can't treat your infection, that's pretty bad for you. But more importantly, this applies to rights, because presumably you're not going to allow people to step into your country day before the election, we have an election tomorrow, vote in the election, and then step out the next day, right? This is really important, so you're also going to restrict people's political rights, because for obvious reasons you don't want all the Israelis being able to walk in Palestine or all the Arabs being able to walk into Israel, vote in an election to overturn and appoint the opposite person there and continue that kind of prosperity. What this looks like then is you have a mass reduction in those types of things. So this is why when they tell you that these things get good for people who have mobility, it's not true, because now there's much less of an incentive to actually move to a developed country, because you'll be forever a second-class citizen, both economically and politically, right? They're not going to grant you any rights. Who the hell is going to give any kind of general rights? It'll take forever to actually be able to apply to become a citizen or whatever it is. Presumably you don't just get it at the border, and there will be no support for those people once they're there. So I think that deals with a lot of the lower, realistic world we hear coming out of CG. Now let's move on to why this extends if we want to play with God's end world scenario, right? This is actually much worse, because what this looks like is privatized military forces, basically city-states in which the only use of monopoly. They keep telling you that these small communities exist. One, I want to point out a temporal problem in their case. They assume we're going back to the 1500s, rather than we are going forward in time. What this means is the current massive conglomerates, multinational companies, basically are endowed with the ability to now become providers of force, providers of military, because these borders will continue to shrink into smaller regions. This doesn't mean there will be no war. It'll just mean the richest little city-states that can hire contractors, particularly massive military multinational firms, to fight their wars for them, or represent most endowment of resources. So if we care about the developing world not shitting on underdeveloped countries, congratulations, that got 1,000 times worse, because now all it is who has the biggest army, and probably guess what? The people who can pay for the biggest army, because that's now the most lucrative business ever, because usually states provide that role. That doesn't happen under their side of the house. I'll take opening.
I mean, yeah, that impact already happens with the amount of paramilitary corporations and the fact that most defense lobbyists have massive alliances with the state. Like, this is just not an argument to this debate.
So imagine if that wasn't even illegal in the international law. Imagine if you could even have international laws. Imagine if you could literally just walk into anyone else's country because there's no governing bodies, there's no collection of states, because it's literally about whichever city-state has the most amount of power. That gets far worse under their side of the house. You get way more oppression, right? It's not that suddenly, because indigenous people have access to these little city-states, that they're going to be great. They're now just at the whims of the larger government, but without any of the rights, because all those rights are predicated on either internationally agreed upon things between states saying, we all want these rights, which isn't going to happen because you're not going to get a billion city-states to agree to a collective set of rights. Obviously, the rich countries are going to only apply rights to the ones that matter, and they're going to continue to have this kind of monopoly on force. What this means, then, is you have no way to prevent violence. You have no way to prevent when people intrude in your territory, because there's no longer that obligation, right? Those obligations have now just become whether or not you can pay for it, because no one is going to let you into their state. It makes no sense for any state to expand its borders more than just the wealthiest people. This means worse differences between developed and developing. Now it's not nations, now it's city-states, which get far more worse because you presumably sign your own laws and build your own militaries. You're never going to let in people of minority groups. You're never going to let in other people. So sure, all the people of one minority group get to live in their own little world, except for one, they can now be invaded at any given time and have their territory taken by the larger, more powerful countries with access to militaries, with access to capital, all those types of things. But more importantly, they can't actually have any sort of recourse. It doesn't matter if you have your own country, if you're still under oppression, and this oppression gets far worse. I've explained why someone has to fill this role, and it will inherently be privatization, because either in macro scale or the micro scale, countries are going to offload their obligations to citizens and offload their obligations to welfare and things like that to privatization to make sure that they don't go bankrupt. The only logical conclusion of having people who just come to your country and vote and take your economic means and things like that. Or on the worst case scenario, it turns into a dystopian hell filled with a bunch of different multinational corporations and city-states who can basically employ force where they want because there's no large coalitions of any countries to stop them. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition extension speaker and call upon the government whip to close up their side of the debate. Thank you.
Two things. First, rebuttal to the opposition extension, then talking about how we change the system and the way the international system works, specifically helping the countries that need it the most. On the opposition extension, first thing they say is that welfare states and all that kind of thing won't happen. Number one, this seems very unlikely because more people over here can vote for it in terms of immigration. At some point, these immigrants will be allowed to vote. We think it's likely. In the same way that Western Europe and Schengen worked in this sense. Secondly, I think people would still immigrate over to these countries in order to get higher wages and because these countries are safer, which means that our mechanism about how these countries still have the incentive to help the developing world is still likely to happen because they do not, if they do not want that many immigrants. Thirdly, it's possible that we have restrictions like 2 years of residence in order to receive the unemployment benefit, like happens in some EU countries right now. But I think that it is very unlikely that people would vote for no welfare state, especially when most of the country does benefit from it right now, especially when it has such a strong political impetus right now. Fourthly, we give you a mechanism, that of interaction between countries, as a reason that people will be more likely to help people from other countries not responded to in the MG. Fifthly, this contradicts opening opposition's claims about how not very many people would be able to immigrate. If it is true, as opening opposition claims, that not many people can emigrate, that means that none of these large changes will actually happen under side closing opposition because they won't have that many people being restrained on the welfare state. We happen to think opening opposition is wrong, but still closing opposition is contradictory. Second thing, they claim that it's terrible because we have a system all with private armies. First on this. I'm unclear about the difference between this and like Schengen or like large states in the size of the US or like the West African Free Trade area. Like it seems to me that if you can move between like thousands of miles, I think this is reasonably similar practically to the difference between being able to move all around the world and these states still are functioning and like have these access to resources, have a functioning state. I think secondly, there's a large incentive for these states to actually have cooperation between them and other states and their police forces, or cooperation with their welfare states, or just like give money in this sense, because these states don't want to spontaneously not exist, and therefore will come up with options that will actually work in this sense. Finally, I think that national armies, if you just think about it in a certain way, are just like very big private armies, and they do destroy people's lives in many terrible ways in the developing world right now. It's not clear to me why, like, their private corporation for a city is any different to, I don't know, some of the very big national military's interventions in the developing world right now in the way that they destroy people's lives there. Now, on our extension and the meat of the debate. Opening governments say that borders are terrible principally, and many reasons that this is really terrible for people. Opening opposition say that this is an aspirational thing. Arthur provides you the link work as to how we go from like the US without any borders to like complete changes in the way that the international system works, and also some transitional benefits as well that are practical. Notice that under this, firstly, that opening opposition's arguments are about a world with nation states. That is why the arguments about trade wars and protection and the arguments of the invasion between nation states are arguments that predicate on the existence of like places with strong borders still. So for instance, if Russia like technically extended the territory that it was responsible for even into the Ukraine, but people in the Ukraine could still move out very freely, could still conduct the same economic activity, etc., but that wouldn't really change anything very substantial under their side of the house. So the first key link here is about access to immigrate. Some reasons why there'll be access to immigrate. Firstly, it's not that expensive to immigrate, and people usually have some savings and amount of money, especially given like the importance of this to them. So for instance, like illegal immigrants right now are not the most privileged people, but they manage to immigrate by saving together and putting together a lot of money because it's so important to them that they would have so much of a better life elsewhere, because they would be safe, for instance, or because they would have higher salaries, or because they would have access to help. Secondly, often people, I don't know, take a bus or they walk. Like there are many wealthy countries reasonably close to countries that aren't that wealthy, which means that people can actually move here. Thirdly, we gave an argument about economies of scale, and how way more people moving would mean that we probably have better roads, more access to buses, all that kind of thing. Notice that we make a principled argument here about an analogy with accepting refugees. That is, I think it is principally important to accept people, even if these arguments, you don't buy all of these arguments, because these people will have a way better quality of life in these countries under our set of hats. I'll check with me.
Okay, so the reason the international community is able to levy sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine is because of a rhetoric that they crossed a border, and the reason that Ukraine is able to defend themselves from Russian takeover is with their army, right? I think that people can't move because of our own analysis. People can't literally move between cities, let alone between entire nations.
I think we've given you a number of reasons that were unresponded to as to why people can move, but I also think that trusting in, I don't know, the ability of Ukraine to withstand Russia seems not to be true, and I'm going to respond to more of this analysis later. Just because Ukraine hasn't withstood Russia, I've also responded to it more previously. Two specific mechanisms, therefore, how we get the dream world that opening government has. Firstly, direct interaction, and secondly, how you can immigrate and influence local governments. You can stack the population of this country in a certain way, which means that, like, if 80% of the population, or 60%, or 50%, or 40% even, are from these other countries, then it changes like the way governments have to actually treat these people, because like you can't just oppress people as if they're a large proportion of the population. They still actually have some influence over them. On opening opposition's material, opening opposition say they can protect smaller countries against things like invasion, against things like human capital flight, which is a weird way to refer to, for instance, people leaving poverty or oppressive regimes, and against trade wars. Firstly, this relies about claims about differential access. Like, I think that countries are instrumental things, and therefore we don't really care about countries, except to the extent that they help the people within these countries, who live within the countries. That happens under our side of the house. Secondly, almost all of this is status quo. They talk about one belt, one road. They talk about Russia Untitled. They talk about Indian doctors. And notice that international pressure would probably stop people from closing borders in this case. But notice now, also, people can't reap the benefits from elsewhere. Two specific ways in which we help the developing world. A, if countries don't want immigrants, they have an incentive to help solve the root problems in these areas. So for instance, the EU says they have too many migrants. They now cannot just close their borders or like turn away ships, but they now have to solve the root problems in these areas. They now have to, for instance, intervene and stop wars in these areas, or they now need to solve poverty by donating a lot of money. So if they want to save their welfare states, for instance, they can just donate a lot of money to these countries and therefore like stop people from being in such terrible situations. The key point here is that they need to make people not want to leave. That is, they need to make people's conditions sufficiently good in their home countries, and we think they have some loyalty to their home countries to the extent that they don't want to leave. B, it helps post-colonial states actually defend themselves. So we notice that the most likely transitional scenario is these post-colonial states will band together, so states like ASEAN or ECOWAS. This is very likely as an intermediate step. Now they can resist the pressures under the status quo that opening opposition say are so terrible. So they're big enough to stand up to China or to stop war or that kind of thing. The closing opposition response that they need capital doesn't respond to the specific response that now they are larger and now they have, because they have free movement and integration between them, which means that they can stop, for instance, Chinese influence against them. This is specifically powerful because whereas we like squabble with opening opposition about like the very relative magnitude of marginal defenses against China, now they will actually be defended. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the government whip speaker and call upon the opposition whip to close up the round for us today. Your turn.
Debate is like each government team has sort of selected one of the burdens that they have to take instead of taking on the entirety of like the actual implications of this in government bench. And so we've ended up with sort of like a bit of debate on like this house believes the Schengen zone should just like be a thing everywhere, and then this house believes we should return to city-states, right? And like neither government teams actually grappled with what this world would look like, how we get to that world, all the sort of things along here. What we tell you in closing government is regardless of what conception of the world that you hear from government, what will happen is the state reduces its ability to serve people, and those gaps will be filled in by private companies, and that will always necessitate worse outcomes. I'll be honest. So let's get into a couple things in this web. There's obviously a lot to deal with because we've had kind of a wild time out here. So I'm going to start with, what are borders, right? What does this actually mean? What does this look like? What are the two worlds that we've sort of created as like possibilities to in the government case, right? And then I'm going to talk to you about both of those worlds and why we went on either of those worlds on closing opposition. So I think we kind of right away from the opening government get a little bit of a confusing conception of what borders are, because they at the same time say like they're just like arbitrary lines drawn in the ground. They also try and convince you that these like arbitrary lines are like the entire locus of like state power and how we're able to have like nation state systems, right? So we tell you we end up with kind of two conceptions, and obviously becomes even clearer when CG gets in here when they say that like part of it's just like more free trade and like economic integration is like sort of like the midway point, but then also maybe we'll have this like utopia where we're like dismantling the state. So how I'm going to set this up, so we're going to talk about this first world where we just have like sort of the CG version of like minor changes and like just better economic integration or whatever, and then I'm going to talk about the OG world of like this like futuristic sort of like city-state kind of situation, and why both of those places you just break down the ability for states to actually serve their people, the obligations that exist, why those are so important. So let's get right into that. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So in the first world, I think first of all, it's a problem that OG just like doesn't engage with this world at all. Like there's a step between like the world we have now and a world without borders, right? And even if it's like aspirational, they don't have to like prove to you these steps will take place, but they should engage with like what the world will look like at some point in that place. Like they should have the word in there, just so you know, right? So CG tells us about this world, right? What does CG tell you this world looks like? So they basically bring you like two kind of major things, right? First of all, they tell you that like you'll just be able to have people like influence policies in these places to like make them more equitable, because now when we have free migration of people, they can go to those places and be like, you shouldn't be as partial, right? This is like they really like lean on the Schengen zone. It's like it's great, everyone has like their own stuff, and they're like not mad at anyone about it. Like of course there's no breakdown of the welfare state, right? But obviously like Brexit literally happened because people were mad that like Polish immigrants come into like Britain and like steal all their money and jobs and like get to benefit from their welfare programs, right? That literally is a mechanism that exists in the status quo, and we give you analysis as to why that would happen more often, because there's like just reasons people to do that, right? You want to protect your own interests, and so you're very likely to either just make it impossible for those people to actually make a change in your country by just giving them less political rights, or and on that note too, like minorities are literally minorities by definition, right? So even if they're like, we'll have like this influx of minorities into these places, you're still literally the minority, so it's very unlikely you'll just like fully change the tide of these places, right? Like that's not that, and it also like works both ways, right? So if you can have like people rushing into developed countries this way, you can also have like Hindus flooding into Kashmir, now changing the entire politics of that country, so you don't have those people either, right? On economic integration, right? So even if we give CG the full benefits of like economic integration will get better on their side of the house, I think it's critical that at best, in their absolute best world, this only helps people who can succeed economically, right? That's generally skewed towards people who already have privilege of some kind, whether it's just like being born with a high IQ or like better class or whatever. Whereas things like the welfare state, which we defend with closing opposition, uplift and protect literally everyone, right? You don't have to be someone who can take advantage of economic integration to benefit from those things. You can just be a person who deserves those rights, right? I think that's really critical. No, thank you. Okay, world two, like about how this like middle world just actually undermines the kinds of things that protect all people within states. And like, so then let's see what happens if we dismantle that state entirely, which is what OG tries to tell you, right? So what we tell you is the critical characterization we get from no one except for my partner is that states exist in a relationship with the people that they govern, right? Government asserts to you that like the only way this relationship can work is one of oppression, right? And like, we're not here to tell you that doesn't happen, right? What we tell you is that uniquely the state relationship also implies obligations, right? State structures uniquely create a relationship of obligations between the state itself and its citizens, right? And so at the very least in principle, these obligations are universally applied to citizens, right? You're supposed to, as a state, like treat all citizens with like they get basic rights, you have to protect them with your military, those kinds of things, right? So even if in practice they aren't always fulfilled upon, on the comparative we bring you is that like corporations are just going to do this, right? Corporations have absolutely no obligation to serve everyone in like a particular area or a particular place. They're actually more likely to just like serve the interests of the wealthy, right? So the comparative here is you just get all the sort of oppression and bad things that you have happening with states, but there's even less reason for that to be equitable or like fair because the corporations have literally no obligation except to the people who are paying them. Like that's a worse world.
We told you that the concept of borders leads to imperialism, the destruction of indigenous communities, and the dissolution of political discussions. These countries do not uphold their obligations. It's not enough to say neoliberal capitalism will destroy us all when neoliberal state systems are perfectly fine with that in status quo.
Okay, so they're really wrestling this idea like it's already bad, right? So I'm going to talk to you about this in a second. Basically a defense of like Blackwater was not a good thing, so therefore we should make Blackwater literally necessary for every single person who wants to protect themselves. It's just not a defense, right? You can say like those things are bad, and at least in the status quo they're somewhat mitigated by things like human rights and like states having to have like things like providing welfare programs and like basic healthcare and education, at least in some cases, right? On the comparative, those things still stay on our side of the house, and they have not proven to any of those things can exist on their side, right? So what does this world that OG paints you actually look like, right? They tell you it's like going to go to like direct democracy, communitarianism. They give us no reason to believe that will absolutely be the case, right? We paint you a much more realistic world. People still have all the needs they have in the status quo, and they need someone to fulfill them. If the state cannot do that for them, they find corporations to fill those gaps, right? That necessarily privileges the wealthy, privileges people who already have power, and it actually looks like violence, right? It looks less like the Kumbaya world then, and more like Mad Max, like dystopian hellscape, right? Like that's pretty bad. We don't want those kinds of things. So I think what we've done for you on facing opposition uniquely is we've taken into consideration what it actually means when you reduce the kinds of frameworks people have within which to fill their needs in the status quo. I think the critical thing here is those needs don't disappear, right? People don't just not need things like healthcare or education or like supports or recognition, right? All those things now have to come from somewhere. So the more you erode the state's ability to provide those things to people, the more you need to force people to search elsewhere for those things. The logical extension of that in the world we live in right now, or even the dream world of OG, is that corporations will fill those roles. They will do a much worse job protecting minorities, will do a much better job of oppressing people than the state even does in the status quo. So proud to oppose.